Well, again, I want to welcome everyone. This has been a really fascinating series over the past several years. And when we first started it, we did sort of different questions, but then we hit on this, and it's been so fascinating to hear all the different perspectives of what would you have to say if this were the last time you were going to address a crowd. You know, what really matters. We've heard from artists and politicians and writers and all kinds of people over the years. So today we welcome Tim Bascom. Tim is the director of the Kansas Book Festival. He worked for 25 years as a writing professor, eventually directing the creative writing program at Waldorf University in northern Iowa. His newest book, Climbing Lessons, is a collection of brief, playful essays about the father-son bond in his Kansas-based clan. Bascom is also the author of 4 other books, including 2 prize-winning memoirs about years spent in East Africa as the son of missionaries, Chameleon Days, which is excellent, by the way, I've read it, and Running to the Fire, which I have not yet read. His essays have been published widely, with several selected for anthologies in Best Creative Nonfiction, Best American Travel Writing. Today, Bascom teaches writing through the Iowa Summer Writing Festival, and he often travels to churches around Kansas with his wife, the bishop of the Diocese of Kansas. So I want to, again, welcome everyone. Welcome to everyone online. Really happy that you're joining us. We will have Tim's books for sale out there. Barbara will be out there. We can take cash or credit card. The books are $20 or 2 for $30. So please welcome Tim Bascom.
Now can you hear me okay?
No.
Better?
Not hearing? Oh, they're saying they're not.
It's good.
Yeah, can you turn it up in here a little bit?
Is it coming up? How does that sound? Is that better for you all?
Back in your pocket.
Yeah? Okay. We're all set. Big thanks to Kelly and to Barbara, who I think also helped to kind of get this whole thing going. It seems like a great program. I'm glad to be part of it. I'm a little intimidated, though. Giving your last lecture, I'm like, am I allowed any more after this, or this is it?
Pretend scenario.
Do people also, go quickly home and work on their last will and testament, or no? Well, I'm a writer, and I've got written notes here, and I'm going to speak off of them. My area of specialization as a writer and a professor is memoir. So it's about memory and it's about stories. And I just want to start by giving you a little sample. It's a first memory from this book, Chameleon Days. When my parents took me to Ethiopia, I was only 3 years old. We immediately went up to a plateau above Addis Ababa for them to learn Amharic, the language, the main language of Ethiopia. And so it was a tough transition for a 3-year-old. They would disappear. I would be left with this strange woman who looked different, and Marta, who would take care of us. And I would go to the outside of the language school and sometimes sit on the steps and listen to them inside as they were doing their thing. I sat and listened and tried to say some of the words myself, joining the whole chorus of voices that parroted these strange words back to the teacher. Ferengi, he announced. Ferengi, they replied, and I mouthed the word too. I had heard this word often because children shouted it whenever they saw me. They chased us white people with this word, grinning as if we were clowns or street performers. This word is for foreigner. You know it, I am sure, but really it is not from Ethiopia. The Italians brought it during the World War II. And so our people learned to call all foreigners by one word. I am afraid you will be hearing Ferengi all the time. Please repeat it, Ferengi. I stared at the poinsettia plants next to the steps with their incredibly green leaves and brilliant scarlet flowers. Ferengi, I said. That's when I saw the chameleon. 3 inches long, it blended in, jade green, with the leaves of the poinsettia plant. Holding its body still, it spun its bulbous eyes, each one gazing a different direction, scanning the 2 hemispheres for danger. Only after 5 minutes did it take a cautious step. Teetering, twitching, it took another step. I held back, wondering if I could be poisoned by a creature so ugly. But after a while, I screwed up the courage to poke the leaf it perched on. At this disturbance, the chameleon clenched into a rigid, crouched stance, as if surrounded by predators. Neither of us blinked. Neither moved. We played a silent staring game, lulled into contemplation by the fat bumblebees that droned over the snapdragons, and by the rhythmic call and response of the language class. The chameleon had one eye fixed on me, but the other swirled, looking for something else to anchor it. Gedelum, said the instructor. Gedelum, replied the class. This is a very useful word in Ethiopia when things do not work as you please. It is the same as it does not matter. Please, let me hear you again. Gedelum, I said, leaning toward the chameleon. I poked at the poinsettia again and watched the chameleon grip more tightly. It trembled. It looked so afraid that I became less afraid. Steeling myself, I lightly stroked its back with my finger. Both eyes swung upward, scanning my finger. The feel of its skin, dry and raspy like emery cloth, surprised me. I brought my face down only a few inches from its face. The pale green neck sagged in a V under its throat, its chin. The dark green lips stretched into a painful grin, pinned back at the corners. Carefully, I pinched the creature between my forefinger and thumb. Then I lifted, feeling it clutch at the poinsettia leaf until forced to let go and swim away in the air. Under the loose skin, I could make out tiny muscles moving and tiny parts trying desperately to find a new balance, a new stability. I placed the chameleon on my palm and steadied it with a finger. It rolled one eye at my face. It rolled the other toward the poinsettia, looking both ways at once. I laughed. This was a wonderful, funny creature, too interesting to let go of. So that's an early experience, maybe my first really vivid memory as a kid in Ethiopia. And I've gone on to publish 2 memoirs, not just this one, but another one called Running to the Fire that you mentioned. We were there when I was very young, and this book, Chameleon Days, gets into being sent to boarding school in only 2nd grade and kind of the damage to the family. The other book was after 6 years in the little town of Troy, Kansas, up near St. Joe, Missouri. We went back again, and the revolution had occurred, and Emperor Haile Selassie had been overthrown, and it was a completely different story. We were running to the fire, so hence the title. Given that I've written that way, plus a couple collections of short essays, it's no surprise that I see life, ourself, our identity, as a story. And I would argue that story is not just for me as a writer, but that all of us, in some sense, could be boiled down to a story, a main story, multiple stories, but a story. Consider the person with Alzheimer's. That person is slowly losing the story, the remembered experience that is who I am. And that's why when we lose somebody that we're close to who has Alzheimer's, it's so painful because they seem gone before they're gone. Because that identity that we knew is going away, and it's about that memory and that story. The neurologist Oliver Sacks, some of you read The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. Have anybody read that book? Or maybe you saw the movie of Awakenings. He wrote both of those. And, he was an expert on how the brain works. And he said that it might be said that each of us constructs and lives a narrative, and that this narrative is us, our identities. Now, this chameleon memory is a vivid one that I insist occurred. I can still see this little creature and a poinsettia plant. Honestly, I've constructed things around it. It's too convenient that I've got Ferengi and Gedellum as the terms, which is to say that in telling you the story, I'm already trying to give it meaning of some sort. And I think we all do that to some degree or less. When we tell a story, we're trying to say, well, what does it mean? So for me, the chameleon is becoming a kind of emblem for myself. Maybe you're picking it up. This is an alarmed creature. It seems alien. Because of it, it's twitchy. And it's got eyes that are looking two directions. It's like two cultures, two worlds, which is what I'm being forced into as this little white boy from Kansas who's suddenly thrown into black Africa, or they would say coffee with cream Africa, because Ethiopia is more of that. So I'm not just remembering, but I'm trying to construct my own plot in a way and construct an identity that goes with that. Now, I grew up in a home of storytelling. My dad was great at it. He was a comic character. He didn't mind being the fool of his own stories. And we had a lot of fun with his misadventures. My newest book, this Climbing Lessons, is a collection of such stories that are mine, his, my son's. We had just males all the way down. There were no daughters for 3 generations. And so I thought, well, I'll write about what it's like as a man and pick up on some of these stories of his. So I wanted to just read you a little bit again. This is what we talked about. This is when I have had my first son, Conrad, and he's just an infant, and I'm visiting my dad in Manhattan, Kansas. During a visit to my parents, I rested my 6-month-old in the arms of my father, who leaned back in a recliner by the iron wood stove and adjusted the sleeping infant to the center of his chest, head under chin. I gazed as Dad carefully arranged Conrad and looked down his nose at the sleeping face, fingering the boy's toes. How strange it was to think of my father as Grandpa. It was weird to put him next to my own grandpa, the tough surgeon with the bushy ears, the man who grew up in North Dakota on a homestead and quoted Kipling and loved hunting and died of liver cancer when I was still in grade school. Thinking that way made me aware that Dad had once had a grandpa. I'd never heard much about that man, aside from stock stories about his life in North Dakota. So I asked suddenly, hey, what was your granddad like? Dad lifted a brow, surprised. There's not much to tell you since Grandpa died when I was 3 or 4. Well, what do you remember? He was a minister. I know that, but what was he like? He must have had a backbone to tell North Dakotans they shouldn't drink. I know that too. You've already told me about the bar owner putting whiskey kegs on his lawn to taunt him. But what about you? I'm curious, what was he like for you? My dad, now a grandfather, had one baby foot in each hand as if weighing them. He lowered his brow and concentrated. Sometimes I got the feeling from Dad that Grandpa wasn't that successful as a minister. Maybe he wasn't cut out for it, more of a scholar. A classics professor originally. I nodded, feeling like we were finally getting somewhere. When Grandpa moved the family onto the farm, that was the first time my dad really felt happy. I think he didn't have anyone to remind him he was the preacher's kid. So was your granddad good at farming? Probably not, Dad admitted. I mean, eventually they moved back to Fargo and opened a boarding house. Dad shook his head wistfully. You know, I can only remember one thing. I sat on his lap. I'm pretty sure of that because I remember putting fingers in his beard. He had a big beard with lots of white hairs. Oh, yes. He also had a little game he tried to teach me. He had a small spring in his pocket, and he liked to push it down and release it, catching it in the air. He would release it and let me try to catch it. Dad brightened suddenly. You know, that spring reminds me of a story Dad used to tell. Apparently one winter night in North Dakota, Grandpa was left at a rural train station by a member of the church he served. He had to wait a long time, and it was bitter cold. He was starting to worry because snow was falling. Anyway, he heard the train coming and saw the light, and he realized it wasn't even slowing. Maybe the engineer couldn't see the station with all the snow. So, without really thinking, my granddad ripped off his coat and threw it at the window of the locomotive. Sounds like a crazy thing to do in the middle of a snowstorm in North Dakota. Exactly, Dad replied, laughing, then peering down his bifocals at the sleeping baby. I doubt he could have lasted an hour without that coat. It drops to 30 below zero up there. In fact, I've told you about Dad losing one of his toes in a blizzard, haven't I? I nodded and grinned patiently. So you're telling me your grandfather almost killed himself by not thinking about potential consequences? No, what I'm saying is that he acted quickly. That was what my dad liked so much, because that coat flew right into the cab and hit the engineer. But what if he had missed? What if the coat got stuck on the train and disappeared into the night? My father peered downward as Conrad shifted his head, pursing his lips. Then he looked up and smiled softly. Well, I guess we wouldn't be sitting here now, trying to decide what kind of a man he was. You can see me in the story reaching for the identity of my great-grandfather. Who was this guy, right? What was his story? And we take these ancestral stories, each of us, and we use them as our own. They become a part of our story, and it's an origin for who we become. And you can see how my dad is resisting my attempt to interpret, which is a negative one. And he's saying, what? Wait a minute. You know, and Dad was like this. He was impulsive, and he liked that this impulsive man just threw his coat at the train. But what does that mean for me as I take that legacy? What is my identity? Who is this real grandfather? Will the real grandfather stand up, right? Now, Dr. Dan McAdams is a psychologist, and he studied the psychological worth of narrative in a book called The Stories We Live By. And his subtitle goes further, Personal Myths and the Making of the Self, a psychologist. McAdams says the stories we create influence the stories of other people, whose stories give rise to still others, and soon we find meaning and connection within a kind of web of story making and story living. Through our personal myths, we help to create the world we live in, at the same time that it is creating us. It's very interesting to think about that, both things happening. When we are connecting stories with others like this, sometimes, though, there is disagreement, right? My hunch is everyone has had this experience. Maybe you went to the Grand Canyon with a family vacation. Your sister's like, do you remember that sunset on the rim of the canyon? And after it went down, just that breeze that came right after in the desert. And you're like, somebody spilled milk in the back of the car. And it just spoiled all the way out there, and everyone was bickering. And those are the two stories, very different, of the Grand Canyon trip. So we have these raw experiences, but we can come up with very different experiences or stories. And the question is, what's the truth, you know? One of the things I guess I would point out is that I think that maybe both are true, and that in some way we help each other through our stories to be closer to what reality is. And so hearing the other person's story is very important, and telling our own is very important as well. Why do we remember so differently? Another question. Why is it so incomplete? I would say it's because we are wired differently, and that maybe we have developed mental tendencies that went with that wiring over time. In my case, I was only 6 or 7 when my mother was already calling me Eeyore. And you know who Eeyore is, right? I know, if you say. He's always, in the stories of Winnie the Pooh, he's the one who's always really, if you insist, we can go to the birthday party. I had a close friend in high school, my closest friend, also a writer. He lives in Canada and has published a number of books, Dan. And it's the most amazing thing to look back at that relationship. Even when we were just, early teens, we had nicknames for each other. He was Desta Lidge and I was Dross Lidge. Desta and Lidge are both Amharic terms for basically joy boy. And I was Dross Lidge. Dross is the biblical term for what's left, the crap, after you make gold. Lidge, crap boy. Anyway, we can be so different, and it affects how we see and how our story gets told. Maybe it's important to recognize one's essential story, to start with seeing one's general outlook in some way. McAdams describes 4 archetypal plot lines in his book on the psychology of this story self. And one of them is, he calls it the dynastic. Don't worry about the terms, I'll just give you what it means. But the dynastic is somebody who has a good past, and it gives birth to a good present. Good past, good present. I was trying to think, well, who is that? I'm such a pessimist. I can't imagine. Who is this person? Weirdly, I thought of Siddhartha, the original Buddha. The reason I thought of him is he went through a period of tremendous turmoil internally and all, but he had a good past. I mean, he was a prince. He was in this enclosure. He had a beautiful wife and child. Everything was good. And he left it because it wasn't somehow enough. And he went through his period of trying to figure things out. And on the other side, he had a good future, a good present, I should say, where he arrived at a new understanding. The antithetical is a bad past that gives birth to a good present. Bad past, good present. I think of Frank McCourt. Have any of you read the memoir Angela's Ashes? He says at the very outset of it, there is no childhood worse than the Irish Catholic childhood, as he's living in Ireland in poverty with a drunken father. Very hard childhood, but he arrives on a boat just as he's going into his 20s in New York, an illegal immigrant, and he's like, the very last word I think is "tis," which becomes the next book. He's looking out at all of it, and somebody says, it's just beautiful, isn't it? It's just, and he's like, "tis." And he's got a good future, good present for him eventually. The compensatory is a good past that gives birth to a bad present. So you go from a great childhood, perhaps, to feeling like, this is where I end up? I think of Hamlet. He's got everything going for him, right? Boy, it's not. His present is turning out really rotten. The self-absolutory is a bad past that gives birth to a bad present. We don't want to think this way, but it happens. Some of us feel like it just never ends. It's just bad. James Baldwin, the author, had a father. He's an African-American writer with a father who didn't trust anyone. He was a minister, but he was severe, abusive even. And he just kind of wizened up and he became this wrinkled old fellow who was very hard to be with. Bad to bad. Which are you, typically? Or why do you think in that storyline? Did something happen that started the trend, making you feel that way, that storyline? Or were you just wired that way right from the outset, that it was inevitable? I think it's worth even turning to one other person and saying, I think the one that I probably identify with, I know that's kind of hard, but is to go ahead and just share it with one other person real quick. So you would be looking at good to good, good to bad, no, wait a minute, good to good, bad to good, good to bad, or bad to bad. And just go ahead and, just for a minute, turn to somebody else and say, okay, I kind of see a trend here with me, or if you're not comfortable, just listen, I guess, to one other person.
Tim, what were you? Which is your
You're putting me on the spot.
Eeyore?
Eeyore.
You're literally on the spot. That's your job today, is to be on the spot.
I think that I have struggled with a sense of being in that bad, and that I tend towards that as somebody who's depressive and doubtful, that's always been a wrestling thing for me. My childhood was full of very rich experience, but not easy. And I've been primarily conscious of difficulty in life. I was in the Philippines in college for 6 months, and I learned the phrase. This shows the way the way I saw the story. Buhay ay talagang mahirap. Life is very difficult, is a sentence that stays with me from that time. A curveball. Maybe sometimes we actually need to be free of our stories. As a reflective memoirist, I think I've rehearsed it too much. It's a problem with the trade. And in some ways, to let go of it has been very important. By the way, some people think that we either have continuous selves or episodic, that we are one identity or that we can change it very easily. And some people experience more of that. Does anybody here have an episodic kind of sense of things, that you get up in the morning, it's a different day, I'm a different person, here we go? But in my case, I think I've always been looking for that continuous self. And I would imagine most people do, I think. And in our need to establish that continuous self, we can reinforce the story so much that it traps us. Is it possible to step away from that version of life? We need to know what it is, but also to have some capacity to step away from it. Some people who are very fixed in it find that they can get there through psychological therapy, and that they find a way to step out of that storyline. For some, that plot change in their life happens with a new situation or some altered behavioral pattern. For an example, you can choose to be active rather than brooding. So you can play soccer, host a gathering at the house, paint the wall, make love. These are things physically and active that can lift oneself out of the storyline, out of the self even. one can make a habit of listing thanks as opposed to complaint, which I'm pretty good at. I don't have to write it down. I've got it going all the time. For many, the release from self or identity happens through religious faith. The Buddhist learns to let go, not clinging to a kind of desired storyline. This is who I am. Instead, letting go. The Dalai Lama says that suffering is rooted in clinging. If only, if only, if only. And letting go of that storyline of desire, that identity, may be a way out of suffering. And of course, for Christians, laying down that personal life for a different, larger life can be a release. Jesus says the person who desires to save his or her life will lose it, but whoever loses it for the sake of the Lord will find it. I think I am using up most of my time, but I'm going to try to wrap up here. So, I have struggled with depression and doubt my whole life. I'm not an exemplar. I nervously stand here. I can see, but not always appreciate, that I have much to be thankful for. I've had a rich life, a trove of incredible experience. It's made me want to tell stories. They are worth sharing. And I'm convinced you have rich stories, that you have rich experience, that your stories are worth sharing. And we are not alone in that reality, even if it is hampered, which it will be. We're human. And I recommend, as a way to remind ourselves that we are not alone, this wisdom from a Scottish author and a minister named John Watson. He used a pen name, Ian McLaren, and he said, "Be kind, for everyone you meet is fighting a hard battle." And more and more I'm struck, it's true. Everyone I meet is fighting a hard battle. I think as you get older, it gets even tougher. Finally, if you struggle with depression, as I do, give yourself moments of not being self-aware. Often the moments that spark my writing are ones when I feel most alive. Paradoxically, that's when I'm out of myself. Those moments occur when I'm active physically, often aware of nature. They occur when I'm in community with others, too, like we're doing today. I'll read a final example, and I'll try to keep this just a little snippet. It's from my third climbing lesson. There are 5 of them in the book, interspersed. And I've taken my sons and my wife camping in Colorado, and this should be great, but everything seems to have gone wrong, from losing the propane for the stove to my son falling in the creek to trying to get started on the hike and the other son falling and scraping his knee and then wanting me to carry him, and I've got a bad knee. And just like, come on, can't we just have fun? And I put down the younger son, and the older one says, "Hey, I got an idea. Let's pretend we are Pokemon." You know, Pokemon? And I'm like, we're in nature, and you want to be Pokemon. I'm just in this bad state, right? But something turns over in me, and I start being a Pokemon. So when at last the 2 boys lag, asking for lunch, I tell them just a little further. I ask what character I can play, maybe an onyx? Then I begin to employ my own special strength, super fast tunneling, to clear a way up the mountain, pouncing out of secret underground corridors and sending foes flying with slashes of my iron tail. I thunder up the forested trail, throwing rock slides to each side, my head blade slicing a ravine. "Come on," I yell, "they can't hit you inside the trench." And when an unexpected Charizard ambushes me from the air, flattening me with a heat wave, my 2 sons come to my rescue, zapping the Charizard right out of the sky and leaving it trapped by a poltergeist. Off we go again, and you'll enjoy this part. Ascending further up the mountain with our unique powers, and Bishop Kathleen comes close behind, jogging and cawing, having transformed into a leather-winged aerodactyl that can dive bomb enemies, stunning them with supersonic blasts. We are all so invested in this make-believe scenario that we are equally surprised when suddenly the trees fall away and we find ourselves standing in an immense bowl above timberline with ragged teeth-like peaks all around and huge fields of fallen snow. Swaths of snow streak the valley walls, secreting streamlets of icy water, and there, right in front of us, is a whole lake, sparkling in the breeze, black in its depths, and emerald along the shore. Guys, I say, there is something we've got to do. Even before we eat, we've got to do this. And I step toward the lake, peeling off my jacket and shirt. No way, yells Conrad, we'll freeze. Yeah, and that's the fun of it, I reply, sitting down to remove my shoes and socks. How many guys do you know who can say they went swimming in a lake that is pure melted snow? After I've pulled off my pants and stand there in nothing but underpants and goose pimples, Luke begins to giggle, sitting down on a rock to untie his shoes. Then his bigger brother begins to unzip his jacket, murmuring, "This is nuts!" Kathleen calls out, "Wait a minute, I've got to get a picture." But before she can fish the camera from her pack, we are out there in the bone-chilling water, balancing on slippery rocks. And before we lose our collective nerve, we hunch our shoulders, count to 3, and plunge down, disappearing into the Arctic liquid. When we heave into the air, our shouts reverberate against the cliffs, making the whole valley tremble. For an instant, we are utterly here in the quiddity of what we have done, completely alive, completely alert, completely aware of the amazing realm that encircles us. And I'll quit there. A big thanks. If you want to get a book, get one, and you got the discount. You get 2 of them for $30.